The sterile hum of fluorescent lights did little to mask the unspoken threat in the air. Arthur O'Sullivan, a man battling a silence that had consumed his home, now faced a new, colder void. A bureaucrat's words echoed, measurable outcomes. His sanctuary, the Story Exchange, was on the chopping block, and with it the fleeting echoes of displaced lives. At 72, Arthur O'Sullivan lived in a house that had forgotten how to make new sounds. The silence that settled after his wife, Eleanor, had passed away 2 years prior was a physical presence, a fine dust of memory coating every surface. Her favorite armchair in the study still held the faint impression of her form, a book of Welsh myths left on the side table, its bookmark forever marking a page she would never finish. Arthur, a retired professor of literature whose life's work had been the study of folklore and oral traditions, now felt like a story that had lost its listener. Eleanor had been his most devoted audience. Now, the silence where her listening used to be was an unbearable void. He was adrift. His only anchor was Wednesday night. Every Wednesday, just as the streetlights began to hum, Arthur would perform a small ritual. He'd put on the tweed jacket Eleanor had bought him for his 65th birthday, its worn elbows a testament to years of leaning on lecterns, and leave his silent house behind. The drive to the Northwood Community Hub was a journey across a border, from the land of the past to the fragile present. The hub was anything but grand. Its fluorescent lights in the basement room cast a sterile, humming glow over a circle of mismatched plastic chairs. But for 2 hours, this room became a sanctuary. This was the Story Exchange, a language-sharing group Arthur had started for the local refugee community. Tonight, the circle was small but potent. There was a family from Syria, their young daughter clutching a worn doll, a young man from Ukraine named Mykola, whose eyes held the gray stillness of a winter sea, and a woman from Somalia who rarely spoke, but always listened with an unwavering, grounding intensity. The air was thick with the scent of instant coffee and the unspoken weight of displaced lives. Here, Arthur was not a grieving widower. He was a gentle custodian. He would begin with a simple Irish folktale, his voice a low, comforting burr, and then the space would open. Someone would offer a story from their homeland, a fragment of a lullaby, a memory of a bustling market, a tale of a clever fox. Words often faltered, languages tangled, but it never mattered. Arthur, with a patient nod or a clarifying question sketched onto a napkin, understood the grammar of loss, the universal cadence of longing. In this humble room, fractured narratives were pieced together, and for a few hours, loneliness was a shared language, not a solitary confinement. Arthur's connection to the Story Exchange ran deeper than simple altruism. It was a lifeline. The drive home each Wednesday was a slow descent back into his own quiet grief. He'd walk through the door and the stories he'd just heard, vibrant, aching, alive, would dissipate into the stillness of the house. He'd make a cup of tea, sit in Eleanor's armchair, and imagine telling her about Mykola's halting description of the sunflowers in his village, or the Syrian family's tale of a mischievous djinn. Eleanor had shared his passion. "Every story is a home you can carry with you, Arthur," she used to say. Now he was carrying them all alone, and the weight was becoming immense. The fragility of this small haven was thrown into sharp relief by the arrival of a new manager at the community hub, a man named Mr. Davies who walked with the brisk, purposeful stride of someone who saw the world in spreadsheets. During a brief visit to the basement room, Davies had surveyed the scene. The steaming paper cups, the circle of quiet faces, the lack of a formal curriculum, with a thinly veiled skepticism. "It's a wonderful sentiment, Mr. O'Sullivan," he'd said, his tone polite but firm. "But we're facing budget reviews. We need to prioritize programs with measurable outcomes. Structured language acquisition, job skills, you understand." The unspoken threat hung in the air long after Davies had left. The potential loss of this space felt like a second bereavement. It wasn't just about the room. It was about the fragile trust built within its walls, a trust that couldn't be quantified on a funding application. This feeling of precariousness sharpened his focus during the next session. An elderly Syrian woman named Fatima, who had been attending for months, finally decided to share. Her voice, thin and reedy, spoke of the garden she had tended for 50 years in Aleppo. She didn't just list the plants, she conjured them. She spoke of the 7 types of jasmine, each with a different scent for a different time of day. Of the apricot tree that grew from a pit her father had planted, its fruit tasting of sunlight and memory. As she spoke, her grandson translated her Arabic, but the real story was in her hands, shaping the air as if she were still pruning the vines. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. Arthur felt a pang of acute responsibility. This story, so rich and vital, existed only in the air between them. Once Fatima was gone, her garden would die a second time. It was a fleeting, unrecorded piece of history, a ghost of beauty. The thought that this, too, could be taken away by a budget cut felt like the final, crushing straw. Into this fragile ecosystem walked Adira Sharma, a 20-year-old sociology undergraduate at the local university. She arrived one Wednesday night with a clipboard and a nervous energy that seemed slightly at odds with the room's quiet rhythm. She was there to fulfill a community service requirement for a course bluntly titled Narratives of Displacement. Her professor had spoken of diasporic communities and intangible cultural heritage, but the academic jargon felt hollow and distant until she stepped into the hub's basement. She chose a chair just outside the main circle, intending to be an unobtrusive observer. She expected to take notes on group dynamics, to document linguistic challenges, to fulfill her hours and write her paper. But then Arthur began to speak, his voice weaving a simple tale about a selkie, and the sterile room seemed to soften at the edges. One by one, others shared. Adira watched, mesmerized. This wasn't a focus group. It was something far more profound. She saw the way Arthur would lean in, his entire being focused on the speaker, creating a pocket of absolute safety. She saw the subtle shift in a young man's posture as he shared a funny memory, a flicker of his former self returning to his eyes. She saw the shared nods of understanding when Fatima spoke of the scent of rain on dry earth. This was the raw, beating heart of the theories she was reading about. It was humanity stripped of pretense, a collection of souls tethered by the common thread of story. After the first hour, feeling a pull she couldn't quite articulate, she approached Arthur during a short break. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I'm Adira. I'm a student. Would it be all right if I recorded the audio? Just for my personal notes. I won't share it with anyone. It's easier for me to listen fully without trying to write everything down." Arthur studied her for a moment, his gaze discerning but kind. He saw not the detached curiosity of an academic, but the genuine engagement of a captivated listener. "As long as you ask each person for their permission first, my dear," he said with a small, weary smile. "Some stories are for the room only." Adira did, and to her surprise, everyone agreed. She placed her phone on an empty chair in the center of the circle, pressed record, and then she simply listened. A tiny red light pulsed, a quiet, electronic heartbeat capturing the ghosts of memory that filled the room. 2 nights later, Adira sat hunched over her laptop in the sterile quiet of her university dorm room. The library was too loud, too full of distracting life. She needed to be alone with the voices. She put on her headphones, clicked open the audio file, and closed her eyes. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Stripped of the visual context of the fluorescent-lit room, the sounds became intensely intimate. She could hear the soft clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug, the rustle of a coat, the sharp intake of breath before someone spoke. The accents, no longer just markers of origin, became melodic, each with its own unique cadence of sorrow, resilience, and hope. It was one thing to see Mycola's sad eyes. It was another to hear the tremor in his voice as he described the exact shade of blue of the sky on the last morning he saw his home. Then came Fatima's voice. Without her grandson's real-time translation, Adira couldn't understand the Arabic words, but she didn't need to. She heard the love, the ache, the sheer, visceral longing in the rise and fall of her speech. It was a pure, unfiltered emotion that transcended language. When the translation followed, the story of the lost garden of Aleppo hit her with the force of a revelation. A thought, sudden and brilliant, flashed in her mind. This wasn't just a collection of anecdotes for a term paper. This was an archive, a living, breathing archive of homes that no longer existed, of lives irrevocably altered. These voices were too important to be confined to her laptop's hard drive or the fleeting air of a basement room. They deserved to be heard, to be preserved with dignity. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her sociology paper forgotten. She plunged into research, her screen filling with articles on digital archiving, oral history projects, and multilingual audiobook platforms. An idea began to take shape, solidifying from a vague impulse into a concrete plan. At the next story exchange, she waited until the last person had left, leaving only her and Arthur among the scattered chairs. Her heart was pounding. "Mr. O'Sullivan," she began, her voice more earnest than she'd intended. "I've been listening to the recordings all week, and I had an idea. It might be crazy, but what if we turned these stories into a digital audiobook? A multilingual one where you hear the original voice first, then the translation. To preserve them. Forever we could call it Echoes of Home." Arthur stared at Adira, the name she had spoken, echoes of home, hanging in the quiet air between them. He was, by his own admission, a man of paper and ink, of tangible bindings and the scent of aging pages. The digital world was a foreign country to him, a place of bewildering speed and intangible connections. Yet the idea Adira presented was not alien. It was a bridge he had desperately needed but had never known how to build, a bridge that could span the chasm between the fleeting, sacred breath of a story and the cold permanence of history. He wasn't just hearing a proposal for a project. He was hearing a solution to the fear that had been gnawing at him. This wasn't just about saving the stories from the whims of a budget-conscious manager. It was about honoring them in a way he had never imagined possible. It was a way to fulfill a silent promise he'd made to Aliner's memory, to keep the stories alive. A slow, profound wave of emotion washed over him. Relief, gratitude, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in 2 years. A vibrant, electric surge of purpose. "That," he said, his voice thick, "is a truly wonderful idea, Adira." From that moment, a quiet partnership was forged, a perfect synergy of analog wisdom and digital fluency. Adira became the architect of the project's digital life. She threw herself into the work, her initial course requirement becoming a passionate mission. She created a simple but elegant crowdfunding page, not just asking for money but inviting people to become guardians of memory. With Arthur's guidance and Fatima's permission, she used a 30-second clip of the Aleppo garden story as the centerpiece, the raw, untranslated audio, followed by the English text. It was more powerful than any plea she could write. Their collaboration fell into a natural rhythm. They'd meet in a quiet corner of the university library cafe. Arthur would bring his old, leather-bound notebooks, his spidery handwriting full of folkloric context and historical footnotes. He would explain the subtle nuances of a Ukrainian tale, the cultural significance of a Somali proverb. Adira would listen, absorb, and then translate his deep knowledge into clear, heartfelt prose for the project's blog, making the academic accessible and the personal universal. The initial response from the crowdfunding campaign was modest, a trickle of small donations rather than a flood. But each one felt like a victory. The first was for $25 from a woman in another state who left a comment. "My grandparents were immigrants. I wish someone had done this for their stories." "Thank you." Arthur read the message 3 times, his eyes misting over. The validation from a complete stranger felt profound. Within a month, they had raised just enough to buy a professional-grade digital recorder and a high-quality microphone. Unboxing the equipment felt like a ceremony, a tangible symbol of their progress. Arthur, who hadn't touched such a device in his life, held the microphone with a kind of reverence. He was no longer just a passive custodian of fading memories. He was a producer, an editor, a collaborator. The silence in his house began to change. It was no longer an oppressive void but a workspace, filled with the hopeful echoes of the voices he was fighting to save. Months passed, and Echoes of Home grew from a fledgling idea into a small but vibrant online presence. The project's blog, meticulously updated by Adira with Arthur's scholarly insights, began to attract a dedicated following. It wasn't a viral sensation, but something more intimate, a small, global community of listeners who left thoughtful comments and shared the stories with a quiet reverence. Each new story they uploaded, Mycola's tale of the feast of Ivan Kupala, a Somalian fable about a wise tortoise, added another thread to their growing digital tapestry. Adira's sociology professor, Dr. Anya Sharma, no relation, a coincidence that always made them smile, was so impressed by the project's integrity and impact that she urged Adira to apply for a grant from the Regional Arts and Humanities Council. "This is more than a student project, Adira," she had insisted. "This is public scholarship. It's important." They spent weeks on the application, Arthur painstakingly outlining the cultural value of the oral traditions, Adira detailing the innovative digital methodology. They sent it off with a mixture of hope and realism, knowing such grants were fiercely competitive. What they didn't know was that their little blog had already found its way to a far more influential screen. In a quiet office in Geneva, a program officer for a United Nations Cultural Heritage Fund, named Kenji Tanaka, was scrolling through a long list of potential grassroots initiatives. His job was to find authentic, community-led projects that were preserving intangible heritage. Most of what he saw was formal, institutional. Then a colleague forwarded him a link to Echoes of Home. He clicked and listened to Fatima's voice. He didn't understand the Arabic, but he understood the cadence of love and loss. He read Arthur's accompanying notes about the gardens of Aleppo. He saw the photos of the mismatched chairs in the community hub. This was it. This was real. The email arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Arthur was in his study, staring out at the rain-streaked garden when his laptop pinged. The subject line read, "Regarding your project, Echoes of Home UN Cultural Preservation Fund." He assumed it was a rejection, perhaps a polite notice that they didn't fit the criteria. He clicked it open. He read the first sentence, then read it again. His hands began to tremble. It wasn't a rejection, it was an offer. The United Nations Fund, citing the project's profound authenticity and vital contribution to the preservation of displaced narratives, was awarding Echoes of Home a substantial grant, enough to secure its future for years, to expand its reach globally. Arthur pushed his chair back, a choked sound escaping his lips. He looked across the room to the mantelpiece, at the silver-framed photograph of Alina, her smile as bright as he remembered. The silence of the house was suddenly filled with an overwhelming rush of emotion. It was validation. It was vindication against Mr. Davies' skepticism. But more than anything, it was a profound, soul-deep comfort. He had kept his promise. The stories were safe. Tears streamed down his face, not of grief, but of overwhelming, luminous gratitude. 1 year later, the basement of the Northwood Community Hub was transformed. Gone were the mismatched plastic chairs and the humming fluorescent lights. In their place was a warm, inviting space with comfortable seating, soft lighting, and at its heart, a soundproofed recording booth. A small, elegant plaque on the door read, "The O'Sullivan Sharma Story Archive." The story exchange was more vibrant than ever, a beacon for newcomers and a cherished ritual for its founding members. The UN grant had not only secured the space, but had legitimized it in the eyes of the hub's management. Mr. Davies now spoke of the project with proprietary pride. Arthur, now 73, moved with a lighter step. The weight of his grief had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. It was now interwoven with a renewed sense of purpose. He was co-authoring a book with Adira, a collection of the stories they had gathered, each chapter a blend of his folkloric analysis and her sociological insights. Adira, for her part, had found her calling. The project had crystallized her academic interests into a fierce passion. She had changed her major and was now enrolled in a graduate program for digital humanities and cultural preservation, a path she hadn't even known existed 2 years ago. The culmination of their year of work was the official launch of the Echoes of Home online archive. At the launch event, held in the newly renovated room, Fatima, accompanied by her son and grandchildren, stood at the front. She wore a beautifully embroidered dress, her face radiant not with sadness but with pride. Adira played the first entry in the archive. Fatima's voice, clear and strong, filled the room, telling the story of her garden in Aleppo, followed by a gentle English translation. As she listened to her own story, now preserved and honored, a single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she was smiling. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Arthur stood by the window, watching the diverse group of people: Syrian, Ukrainian, Somali, local students, community leaders, all mingling, sharing food and laughter. He realized that in his quest to save the stories of others, to build a home for their memories, he had inadvertently rebuilt his own. A stranger's idea, a student's unexpected dedication, had not just rescued a project. It had rescued him, leading him out of the silent house of his past and into a future filled, once again, with the sound of living stories.